I am pleased to introduce Dr. Weiss, who is an urban wildlife ecologist and a conservation scientist. She received her PhD at Arizona State and is now a first-year assistant professor at Marist University. Dr. Weiss's research investigates how urbanization and other profound disturbances impact mammal communities, often with a focus on phenotypic trait variation. And she's working to understand and advance a conceptual framework for thinking about how trait-based approaches can help identify the ongoing social, ecological, and evolutionary processes and pressures shaping wildlife health and sustainability. Kate's been active in the Arizona Phoenix CAP urban program, which of course we have a lot of exposure to through BES and the Baltimore Ecological Study. And so I've been excited to learn that she has moved to this side of the country and look forward to getting to know more about her work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great introduction. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes. Wonderful. I love being heard. So hi, my name is Kate Weiss. And as Shannon noted, I am an urban wildlife ecologist, so I study animals in cities. And I do this now at Marist University in Poughkeepsie. But I came here from Arizona State, where I spent 7 years working on my PhD, mostly looking at coyotes and bobcats, particularly in the Phoenix metro area, and thinking a lot about their distributions, what they're eating, so on and so forth. And we will talk some about that today. However, I do want to first introduce kind of my general research perspective and what I think about more broadly, right? Not just about the particular species or like the particular things they're doing, but more broadly, what is my research perspective? And so I do work that seeks to promote more sustainable interactions between people and wildlife species. What does this mean? Right? So often, in my field at least, you hear people talk about human-wildlife coexistence, human-wildlife conflict, right? But we don't talk about necessarily sustainable interactions. Why don't I just say coexistence, right? Seek to promote coexistence. And that's because coexistence, I think, has some subtext in it that maybe isn't fully accurate, right? Coexistence sometimes suggests, rather, what does that look like? Right? What does coexistence actually look like? What does it actually mean, right? Because some might say coexistence is never seeing each other ever, and we all live in little bubbles, and we never interact, and that's wonderful, right? But is that realistic? Can I get some you can shout it out. Is that realistic? No, right? Sorry, I'm an educator. I gotta have the two-way feedback. So not realistic, right? And instead, what we really see in urban systems in particular is that human-wildlife interactions, they're not going away, right? They're not going away, and that's because the world is becoming more and more urbanized, right? And so we start to see wildlife species do things like going in our trash, coming into our neighborhoods, sometimes preying upon our pets, right? Spreading disease. There's all of these kinds of challenges that often happen when these wildlife enter cities, and they often enter them because it's good for them, right? There's lots of positive pressures for them to come into an urban environment for a lot of these species. There's release from apex predators, right? So there's not as many mountain lion or wolves or other sorts of things in the urban environment. So for a little raccoon, that is great. There's lots of human food subsidies, right, that we provide. So there's lots of these kinds of benefits, but those benefits can be a problem for us, right? We don't like having raccoons going through our trash. It's not sanitary. It can change their behavior. It can make them more bold. It can make them more likely to interact with people in an adverse way, right? And so that is where we get to this sustainable interactions, right? How do we coexist, yes, but in a way where we recognize neither of us are going anywhere, right? I don't think we want wildlife species to leave, right? We have a lot of key ecological processes that are essential when these animals are in our systems. And also, like, look at him. Look at that guy. You want him to go away. How dare you, right? And so I think we need to kind of change our framework to thinking about, yes, coexistence, but what does that mean? It means sustainable interactions through time, right? And figuring out how we do that, right? And so said another way, my work is at this intersection of wildlife conservation and ecology, urban ecology, and wildlife management. And more specifically, I'm really interested in the following dynamics or feedback loop that I'm going to outline for you now. So when we have wildlife in an urban environment, right, that is informed by their distributions, adaptations, plasticity, all of these things that result in whatever's in the regional species pool, right, ultimately getting into the urban system. And now, as I mentioned before, a lot of those species that can make it tend to have traits and characteristics that are really great for them at utilizing those new resources and spaces, but not so great for us. And that often results in human-wildlife interactions, right? And when we have a human-wildlife interaction, particularly an adverse one, what do? We call up DEC, right? Or we call up wildlife control services, and we say, get this animal out of my yard. I don't care what you do, get them out, right? Wildlife managers do really important and really great work, but they also have so little time and so little money, right, to be able to do a lot, right? And they're getting so many calls. And at the end of the day, what they need to do is stop the calls from coming in. And so that often results in wildlife managers going in and culling or killing, right, and removing animals from the population. Now, any of us that has a background in evolutionary biology knows that when you go in and remove individuals from a population, you're now changing population demography, behavior, and you're adding essentially a selective pressure, right, onto the population in question, sometimes in ways that can actually make these human-wildlife interactions more complex and more problematic. For example, let's say you go and remove individuals that are really obvious and goofy at figuring out how to access human food subsidies, and so this provides a selective pressure for maybe individuals who are better able to access those food subsidies while being less detectable by people, right, from allowing those sorts of individuals to enter the urban matrix. And now you have a real problem on your hands, right? And so it's this feedback loop that I'm infinitely fascinated by, right? And in trying to figure out how we can mitigate this to, again, promote more sustainable futures for us all, because I want us all to be happy, right? Okay, now, why cities? So I gave some information as to why cities, but there are so many places, right, that we can study in this world, and so many different kinds of environments. And in particular, I mentioned that not only do I consider myself an urban wildlife ecologist, but also a conservation biologist and conservation scientist. And cities, generally not what we're thinking of when we're thinking about conservation, right? We think about conserving wild species in wild places. And don't get me wrong, I've done a lot of work as well thinking about recovery planning under the Endangered Species Act and things like that, which I don't have time to talk about today, but would be happy to talk about later. But I also consider the work that I do in cities to be conservation focused as well. Why is this? Conservation needs begin where environments change, right? And so cities can actually be really great places to understand exactly what causes some species to essentially make it, right, in a city, which then gives us information about implications for more sensitive species that can't, right? And so if urban systems are just going to be increasing, right, and taking up more land and causing more possible interactions with wildlife species, particularly those of conservation concern, what better place to investigate these kinds of questions than in an urban setting? And in line with that, urbanized areas both support and threaten biodiversity, right? As I mentioned, there are some species that do great in an urban setting, that do really, really well. And that is in large part because we also are natural beings, right? Just like the mighty beaver, we too are ecosystem engineers. And the ways in which we change landscapes often involve incorporating nature because we too are natural. So here is Culver City, California, and of course we see this embedded urban matrix, but it is embedded within a network of trees, right? And we can argue all day about, are these the right trees? Where are they placed? How is this contributing to other important ecological processes? Absolutely. But speaking particularly from a mammal perspective, which is my general perspective, right? This is both deterring some species that require large spaces, but also promoting the abundance of some species, right? And so a really great opportunity to really kind of study the tension between these kinds of dynamics. In addition, 2/3 of people are expected to live in cities by 2050, and urban land cover is expected to triple between 2000 and 2030. And I don't know if you know it, we're fast approaching, right? We're almost there. So much so I might need to start looking for a new statistic there to reference. But nonetheless, right, urban spaces and people, we're not going anywhere, or I hope not. I like being alive. I like being here. I like the communities we foster, right? But clearly we're doing things in not a sustainable way, right? So how do we do that and navigate that, particularly given the extensive need, right, that we can see here? And then finally, something else that I think is just really interesting about cities is that because, again, we're ecosystem engineers, we structure cities to meet our needs. And so urbanized areas are often more similar to each other than to their rural counterparts, right? Which means that we have essentially a bunch of replicates, right, that are potentially providing similar kinds of pressures on wildlife species in ways that, if we can better understand it, maybe then we can make some predictions and actually start to solve some problems, right? Wouldn't that be great? Actually solving problems with our science, that's the holy grail. And so that is why I focus on cities. Now, I'm a wildlife biologist, wildlife ecologist, so it always comes back to the animals for me, because aren't they just the best? I just like them. And so which species persist in cities is a question that's been noodling around my mind forever. When I started graduate school, my pie-in-the-sky goal was like, I'm going to figure out what makes an urban animal urban, right? I want to know what is it about these species that can make it, quote unquote, compared to these other ones. And so what do we know about which species persist in cities? Well, we know that species filter from regional to urban species pools, given essentially their traits, right, the characteristics that they have, as well as the social ecological conditions in which they live. So for example, here's a hypothetical regional species pool, more southwest based, but these are all the species that we would expect to find in an area absent of people, for example. So let's say we have a mountain lion, a coyote, a bobcat, a little cottontail rabbit. They're all living there and experiencing all the things that animals do when living in a particular environment. Now, as we filter into the urban system, we have some filters, right? We have some trait filters like body size or diet. So for example, we don't see many mountain lions in urbanized areas, LA notwithstanding. And that has a lot to do with the fact that their bodies are so big, they require so many calories, right? They really gotta beef up, right, to be able to support that body mass. And that often is just not possible in an urbanized setting where resources are so distributed and the large prey that they eat just aren't there, right? And so they often can't hack it in an urban setting. And then there's also social ecological filters, right? So things like socioeconomics, right? There's now been all this information about the impacts, for example, of redlining on wildlife communities and on legacies of wildlife communities based on where trees are planted and how that impacts wildlife distributions, right? Also things like wealth impacts all of that too, which can affect where animals are located. Things like human facilitation, right? So we bring species with us, like domestic cats, for example, domestic dogs, pigeons, rats, right? All those sorts of things we introduce. And then there's also more species interactions, right? You come into a truncated space, sometimes that means there's more opportunities for species to interact. And so that also plays a pretty significant and important role. And so all of these together influence what we find in the urban species pool, right? Which can be some species that are native to the area that make it, like here a coyote and a cottontail rabbit, but also some that we introduce, right, like the domestic cat and the rat. Now, there are 1,000 trillion really cool and interesting things that you can investigate and study here, and I have a lot of colleagues that do some really incredible work looking at all of the complex minutiae herein. But the part that I'm really interested by are these trait filters. And that's because those are opportunities for adaptation at multiple scales, right? So if we go back to that conceptual figure with all the Venn diagram that I showed, right, where I'm saying, how do we understand what is causing these kinds of human-wildlife interactions? What is the underlying sources of these problems? How do we mitigate them such that we don't have animals evolving in ways that make them even harder to deal with? That really calls for understanding these trait filters, right? And again, at multiple scales, because what's happening at our neighborhood scale is going to have different selective pressures than at the city scale, than at the even broader scale as well, right? And so by looking at traits, we can better understand how and in what way animals persist in cities. And a lot of folks have done a lot of great work on this, myself included. Well, I mean, I hope it's good, but I've done a lot of work on this as well. And so a lot of this work is still, though, trying to understand, okay, but what makes an urban animal urban, particularly an urban species, right? It's historically been really at the focus at the species scale. And here's just some examples of some papers that I've written on that in case it's of interest. And would be happy to chat about those later. But overall, within the field, this kind of framework is pretty popular and one that we use quite commonly. You may have heard of some species. Has anyone heard like the terms urban exploiter? Like as a species? No? Oh, this is fun. Okay. So in the wildlife biology, urban wildlife ecology in particular world, there's specific species that we've often labeled as being urban exploiters, meaning those that are really able to live within an urban setting. Urban adapters, which are ones that are kind of more often in suburban locales and kind of like can kind of be in the city, but kind of like to be kind of more in the sort of intermediary edge kind of environments. And then avoiders, which are species that we don't really often find in an urban setting. And so this is the urban exploiter, avoider, adapter framework. Now, again, I am an educator, and so I do want to take a moment for a brief discussion and see what your all's thoughts are. So I would like you all to think about, consider what mammal species, that's what I study, so we got to stick with the mams. Consider what mammal species you think of when you think about urban exploiters, right? The mammals that you think of when you think of a city. And why do you think they're able to fulfill that ecological niche? So chat with a friend for a moment, and then we'll all come back together. Isn't this fun? We're lifelong learners. All right. So we're all going to come back together. I know that was very brief, but I talk a lot, so I got a lot to get through. But let me hear what you all have to think. What is a mammal that you think of when you think of an urban environment? Just raise your hand. Oh, yeah. Rats. Oh, yeah, the rats. Squirrels. Yes, we see so much of that. Yeah. Raccoons. We love a raccoon moment. Yeah. Monkeys in some urban contexts, absolutely, right? Like in India, that's like macaques and things like that are super prolific in those kinds of environments. Yes, absolutely, right? These are all great examples. Yes? Deer, white-tailed deer. Oh, those guys are everywhere, right? So it seems. Yeah? Dogs, right? Our domestic dogs are little fun guys. I got three of my own. So yes, I'm contributing a lot to that value. Yes, excellent. These are all wonderful examples. And what do you think? Like, why do you think they're able to fulfill that niche? Right? Why are they able to maybe succeed in an urban setting? Yeah. Generalist diets. That's a big one, right? Being able to potentially utilize and access multiple kinds of foods. Yeah. Our food, right? Oh, we got so much carbs and fats and all the good things that we eat, right? All that processed food, delicious. Yes?
Some of them don't have fear anymore.
Some of them don't have fear, right? Maybe kind of, and a lot of work is being done thinking about boldness in a lot of these animals. Through like flight initiation distance tests and things like that. Yeah, so that's certainly an aspect. Absolutely, right? So basically what you all are touching on is this, it seems like there's probably this confluence of traits, right, that seem to be consistent with the species that we think of as persisting in an urban setting. Yes, absolutely. And so this is something that some colleagues and I tested. Using Snapshot USA, which is a national, and I think increasingly starting to become international, group of camera trappers. Have folks here heard of camera trapping? Wildlife cameras? Yeah, so I do a lot of my work through camera trapping, right? It's these cameras you put out in the environment, and they take pictures of animals passing by, and you can do lots of cool analyses using that. And so Snapshot USA has collaborators in all 50 states of the US, as well as, again, some new international partners. And during the fall season, we do a snapshot of the wildlife that are found in a given area in the fall. And from that, we can ask some pretty cool questions. So some colleagues and I asked, among all the species that we found from these cameras, which, as a note, no, rats are not on here because they're often too small for the cameras to reliably detect. But we asked, how urban are they? Are they actually urban exploiters or not? And so here we have urbanization response on the y-axis, and this line right above that is an urban exploiter, and below that is not an urban exploiter, meaning they were not found in an urban setting more often than they were found not in an urban setting. Words are hard sometimes, yes. And so you get what I'm saying. And so what did we find? So we found that actually very few species were found predominantly in urban settings. For example, we have domestic cat, red fox, raccoon, gray squirrel, right? Some of the ones that you all mentioned, pretty classic. But also some species that we were surprised about were not more associated with urban settings compared to others. So for example, eastern chipmunk, coyote, white-tailed deer, right? Not considered to be urban. And now here, I think the coyote bit might surprise you, but coming from being trained in the Southwest, those coyotes are everywhere, right? Which again, this is starting to get at this variation question, right? Why are coyotes found everywhere in the Southwest, but not out here, right? Why is it that white-tailed deer are found everywhere out here, but not in the Southwest, for example, right? Or I should say mule deer instead, right, of white-tailed deer. And so this is kind of really interesting and increasingly perplexing that, yes, again, there are some species that seem to really make it, right, in a city. But for the most part, most species aren't. Now, lots of hypotheses as to why this is. For example, with the coyotes and deer, I think this is actually more so just they can make it anywhere, right? It's not that they are more often found in cities, they're just found everywhere, right? But nonetheless, perplexing, particularly if we are trying to seek generality, right? And seeking generality in ecology, oh, it's this giant weight upon our shoulders, right? That we are struggling to achieve. How do we achieve generality in ecology? And in this case, in urban ecology or urban wildlife ecology. And this, particularly with the traits, has been really hard because weirdly enough, aside from litter size, there has been no consensus in the literature of generalist or other traits resulting in urban exploitation across taxa in mammals. Within taxa, yes, particularly carnivores, right? We see this a lot in carnivores. But across taxa, no, right? A lot of these assumptions that we have, it's these generalist traits, it's this, this, and this. We can think of it off the top of our heads because we see it. But when we test it, not the case. And this is even for things that we thought we had figured out. So for example, Caitlin Gaynor published this wonderful paper, and colleagues posted this wonderful paper in 2018 where they found that mammals in cities often have increased nocturnality, right, are more nocturnal than in non-urban areas. And their data found that, right? But then there have now been multiple other studies looking at it and have found it's true of some species, but actually not all, right? And not, like for example, here, mean global human footprint is on the x-axis. This is some recent work that some collaborators and I have done, looking and assessing when wildlife are active, using, again, these kind of large camera trapping networks. And then on the y-axis here, we have probability, nocturnal, diurnal, cathemeral. Cathemeral means that they're awake all the time. Like, it doesn't really matter. They can be up at night, during the day. I'm like that sometimes. And so we see there's really no relationship, right, across species. Again, within particular species or even groups of species, we do see these relationships, but across, we don't. And so there is, so yes, we see this significant variation across taxonomic groups, and even within the concept of variation itself. So I was so irritated by all of this that I was like, okay, maybe it's that these species, maybe the generalism is about the variation within the traits that they have, right? And so I looked at variation, like average levels, like average trait values of mammals, and then the variation around that from the literature, and did all of this stuff to see the relationships with all of those species to urbanization, and found, again, the only one that was significant at the community level was litter size. That was it, right? And so overall, outside of some of these demographic traits, what is it? What makes an urban animal urban, right? What is happening here? So what gives, right? What is happening? Well, what makes an urban animal urban? I think maybe we're asking the wrong question, right? Let's go back to basics for a bit. What is the fuel of natural selection? What is the fuel of evolution by natural selection? You can shout it out. Variation, right? That is the fuel that makes everything run, variation. So why are we trying to figure out what is true in all scenarios, right? Why is that something that we're so obsessed with, myself included, right? In addition, intraspecific competition must be greater than interspecific competition for coexistence to occur, right? Community ecology 101, population community ecology 101, right? So variation promotes coexistence. This is the foundation of niche partitioning, right? Right? And in line with that, species change relative to the environment. So there's also variation at different scales and in different contexts. And as I often tell my ecology students who hate it when I say this, but the answer to every question in ecology is it depends, right? That is. And that's not because we can't learn true things. That's because it is about the context that it's in. And if you know the theory doesn't change, right? The theory stays the same. But if you apply it to different contexts, then you get different outputs. And so why are we looking at the outputs when instead perhaps we should be looking at the inputs that are affecting those mechanisms that cause context to be so important, right? So again, why are we trying to see when they're all the same? And so I argue, instead of seeking generality, we should be seeking these explanations for variation, right? And again, as I just mentioned, seeking generality of mechanisms of variation, not of the outcomes. So for example, we see this here. Remember earlier I said urban systems are more similar to each other than to their rural counterparts. This is a phenomenon called ecological homogenization. Now that's not to say that there isn't significant variation also at smaller scales between urban systems, but overall, right, bird's eye view. And we can see that here, but the homogenization actually means something quite different in context, right? So here, for example, we have Miami, Florida, up top, quite wet, famously wet, right? We move into the city and it becomes drier, right? On the other hand, Phoenix, Arizona, famously dry, can confirm, did live there for 5 years, famously dry, and we like similar kinds of environments, so we make it wetter, right? So these two end up looking the same, but their context couldn't be more different, right? So an animal that's trying to enter the urban matrix here is dealing with a whole different set of challenges and situations, right? Because they're moving from an area that's dry to wet. Famously, we like water, right? Compared to animals that are moving from an area that's abundant in water and then subsequently drier, right? And so by understanding that kind of theory that is on the other side of the context, we can then actually make some helpful predictions, right, about what might be happening to species in these different areas. And so that maybe is how we start to get to the generality, right? Within ecology is taking advantage of the variation, using that to our advantage. And this is important not just for science, but also for wildlife management, right? Because there are many questions within wildlife management and wildlife ecology that have been just a thorn in my side for so long. For example, and this is one that I'm going to talk about somewhat today, why do some coyote populations eat a lot of cats and others don't? I spent like 7 years trying to think through this question. I still have lots of thoughts and feelings about it. But this I also think is really interesting because domestic cats, you might think, well, a coyote is a larger predator. It's going to eat a smaller animal, and that's that. But cats are actually more similar to the things with which coyotes normally compete with in nature, right? Like bobcats, foxes, and they'll sometimes eat those animals, but more like from the perspective of intraguild predation, right? As opposed to like intentionally trying to eat it. But then in some contexts, particularly in the West, where coyotes make up like of scat analyses, like 20% of scats have domestic cat remains in them, significant part of the diet there. But then here in the literature, it's like nothing, right? We hear a lot about the coyotes are going to eat your cats, but in the literature at least, there's like not a lot of coyotes eating cats out here, right? And so what in the world is up with that? In addition, there's questions like, why do some areas vary in the amount and timing of nutrients deposited downstream? Now, this might not sound like a wildlife management question, but this is something I'm going to talk about later in the talk here today, where we think maybe beaver have something to do with this, right? And then finally, why do some urbanized areas have lots of wildlife kind of visible throughout the region and others just don't, right? What's up with that? And so by understanding why these differ, we can actually solve problems and then promote these more sustainable futures for people and wildlife species. Okay. Now, I just spent 30 minutes with an intro, which I'm sure is very normal and standard behavior. But what does this look like in actual data, conceptual or otherwise, right? So this leads us to the SEEP framework, which some colleagues and I currently have in review in the Journal of Biological Reviews. And we're calling it the SEEP framework because we got to call things weird acronyms that don't mean anything. And this stands for social-ecological-evolutionary phenotypic framework. I don't know. It looks good on paper. So the SEEP framework, and what does this mean? So this has to do with how do we approach generality in urban ecology? Well, maybe we figure out the inputs, not the outputs, or use that for the generality component, right? And how do we do that? We go back to my friend, the phenotype, right? Phenotypes are directly impacted by those inputs, and they're measurable, right? There's something that we can measure. And so using phenotype as a linkage between the inputs and the outputs then also gives us something to predict, right? If we're in an environment and we say, okay, we know that these are the inputs, we know that this is the theory, and it's in this particular context, and we want to know, are coyote diets, diet being a phenotype, going to change relative to these inputs? In a hypothetical world where all this work is already done and we already have all of the data and information, we could put that in a model, right? And then create a prediction of what's going to happen in a different particular locale, given all of the variation and the things that we don't, can otherwise have trouble quantifying. And so we argue using phenotype as that linkage. And then what are the inputs, right? The social, ecological, and evolutionary processes that all come together to affect what we are observing. Which again leads us to this framework. So what does this look like? Oh my gosh. So as any good conceptual model, it must be as complicated and illegible as humanly possible. So let me walk us through this for a brief moment. This is essentially everything we've been talking about already, right? But in one figure, which means it's too much. But we worked really hard on this, though. No, okay, so, right, let's say we have this regional species pool that's also informed by a broader global context, right? And those species end up into a city ultimately, but first have to go through all these filters, right? So things like historic redlining, zoning, public parks, tree canopy, impervious surface temperature, right? All of these things feed into the matrix of situations and filters that species can enter in. And then as we move through, right, there's all of this kind of evolutionary processes that are happening. There's, as well as community ecological processes happening, right? There's dispersal, there's selection, there's genetic drift, right? Particularly in these more truncated areas. Phenotypic plasticity, right? All of these things are kind of happening all at once through these series of interactions that then result in differential phenotypes. And as I mentioned before, those phenotypes can sometimes result in human-wildlife interactions, right? Sometimes they're positive, right? You see a bird in your bird feeder, that's a positive kind of human-wildlife interaction. But sometimes they're negative, right? Or sometimes they're perfectly neutral, but we perceive them as negative, and then that influences our behavior, right? In ways that can have downstream effects. And now those sorts of things can also happen at multiple scales, right? So we can have it at an individual parcel, a neighborhood or community scale, and even a regional landscape scale, and that influences things like wildlife management decisions and other sorts of political processes that then, wouldn't you know it, change the landscape. And then, oh, we're in this feedback loop, right? Look at this, such a self-reinforcing mechanism. It's beautiful. And so this is ultimately the SEEP framework. And this is in large part how I think about these sorts of things. Now, conceptual diagrams are great. They're so fun to make because you don't actually have to test anything and learn that they're wrong, right? And so these conceptual frameworks, they're a dime a dozen. But what does this look like in practice, right? What does this actually look like? And this is more a conceptual framework, right? A way for us to rethink how we're asking questions, right? And then applying those questions. And so what does this look like in practice? Well, I'm going to give an example as it relates to some of my past work thinking about why in the world do coyotes in some areas eat so many darn cats? Ah, thorn in my side, as I said, such a question and problem. And this is a real challenge in a lot of areas. So here is a camera trap image of a coyote, indeed, with a domestic cat in its mouth. And I collected many a scat, many a coyote poop, and I can confirm, as you will see later, that they are certainly eating cats out there. And so why are they eating them in some areas but not in others? Well, so for my dissertation, I thought about this in a few ways. I thought, well, maybe there's just a lot of cats, right? Maybe there's just so many cats that none of it matters, right? And it's actually just a numbers thing. And it's actually low relative to the amount of everything else that they're eating. And so I assessed that, and that doesn't seem to be the case, right? I don't have time to show the data for that. I developed these methods that are currently in review in Journal of Animal Ecology, thinking about how we can use camera trap data and scat data to understand how availability in space, time, or both contributes to diet selection of coyotes. Happy to talk about that at another time. But long story short, doesn't seem to be that. So what else could be going on? Well, what else could it be? Go back to that SEEP linkage between the phenotypes and the inputs. So I thought maybe it has to do not just with diet in terms of whole food items, but macronutrients, right? What is it about the cats? Like, what is it about the cats that they like so much? What is it? Turns out cats are a high-fat food. They're like little protein fat bombs, but heavier on the fat. And we'll talk in a minute about why that is a great thing for a coyote. And so I thought maybe that has something to do with it. And maybe, and granted I only tested this in Phoenix, Arizona, and there's also a lot of caveats, I gotta say. But so I haven't tested this in areas here where we don't see a lot of domestic cat consumption. But we could test it and see if there's differences and see if that could potentially, right, explain some of what's going on. So what are the inputs here? Social-ecological urbanization, right, that impacts all aspects of that. And then evolution, carnivore physiology, right? Why do they need and require certain macronutrients? Well, different compositions of macronutrients contribute to fitness, right? And that is well evidenced in the literature. So this work that I'm about to share is also in review in Ecology and Evolution right now. Recently accepted with minor revisions, woohoo. Okay. So what does this actually look like? First, why macronutrients? So food is everything, right? Food is everything. We had those cookies outside. We know how important food is. And food is essentially made of macronutrients, right? And macronutrients are carbohydrates, which predators get from non-prey, and then also lipids or fats and protein, which they get from prey. And that is energy or calories, which we measure as calories, and that directly contributes to reproduction, behavior, and health, right? So all of those challenging behaviors that I mentioned, right, also directly fed and influenced by the food that they're eating, right? And different macronutrients do different things in the body and take more or less energy to metabolize. And the key thing here, at least as it relates to this talk, is that many species, particularly other omnivorous carnivores, such as bears, have been evidenced to seasonally change their consumption of non-protein energy, meaning fats and carbs, when their protein needs are already met. What does that mean? Why is that the case? Protein, super important. There is so much going on right now about we need to eat so much protein, right? We're gonna be big and strong. But actually, protein is great. We need it. Helps with immune function, helps build our bodies up. But it also takes a lot of energy to turn it into energy, right? And so because of that, many species, once they reach the limit of what they need, which is called an intake target. And an intake target is basically when people have put an animal in a laboratory setting with a bunch of different diets that have specific macronutrient compositions, and they see what they self-select for, right? What ratio of these do they self-select for? And that has been evidenced to correspond with fitness. And we see that once that basic intake target of what you need, the base level for protein is met, a lot of species will say, I don't want any more protein, I want these guys, because they don't take as much energy to turn and use for energy, right? And so maybe that is a contributing factor here. And so the research gap was we do not know if coyotes differentially consume macronutrients generally in urbanized areas or in ways that influence diet selection or management needs, right? So no one has looked into this before. There have been some studies, I will say, looking at isotopes, right, to look at proportions of protein in particular, but the key thing here is that macronutrients actually do not exist in isolation, right? We need all three concurrently at the same time, and so you really, to understand it fully, you have to understand them in the context of each other. And so this is looking at all of them. So where did I do this? So this was done in Phoenix, Arizona, right, along a gradient of urbanization. And Phoenix metro area was a great place to do this because it's one of the most populous cities and metro areas in the US. And then we collected camera and scat data across 2 seasons. As a note, I'm not presenting the camera data today, but just noting that, because I know there's lots of folks here who do a lot of great camera trapping work, and so just wanted to mention that I also do a lot of that as well. And so what did this look like? So we went out in the field, collected a bunch of stuff, a lot of cameras, a lot of scat. Oh, have I touched many a poop. Oh, so much poop have these hands seen. And the cool thing about poop is that once you get rid of the poop part, which is as disgusting as it sounds, you then are left with beautiful, fluffy, luscious prey remains that can't be digested, right? So we have things like rabbit mixed with trash. We have things like cat with a lot of cat claws. They ate the whole thing, guys. What? Birds, mesquite, we're gonna come back to that. They loved a mesquite seed. Mesquite are a tree, a shrubby tree in the Phoenix metro area, and they have these carbohydrate-rich seeds, or seed pods. The seeds they don't eat, but the fruit kind of inside the pod they do. Anyways, and then this is actually my favorite sample. It had some small rodent here. This is all grasshopper. These are snake scales, and then a single Jack-in-the-Box hot sauce packet. They truly are just like us, you know? It's beautiful. It's truly beautiful to witness. And so what did we do with that information? Well, we took the poop, we extracted the hard parts for ID, which you just saw, and then we calculated the percent volume that each of those diet items contributed to their diets. And then we looked through databases and the literature to identify the macronutrient composition of the prey. And then from that, linked it together, right? Identified from that the macronutrient composition of the scats. And then from that, we can plot the relationships. Now, I do want to note, I've done a lot of very complicated stats in my time. We do not have enough data to do complicated stats with this. This is an observational, pattern-based analysis via what's called the geometric framework of nutrition, this idea that we can plot the relationship between these 3 different macronutrients in physical space, right? But we do not have we don't have statistical numbers around these values, right? Which is a huge caveat, right? And so we can talk about that later as well. But it's read on this right mixture triangle, this graph. On the y-axis, we have percent energy contributed by fat, percent energy contributed by carbs, and then on the z-axis, we have percent energy contributed by protein. And moving down is increasing protein, and moving up is decreasing protein. So what does this look like relative to our hypotheses? So let's say we're saying there is no difference in macronutrient consumption with urbanization and or season, and then the circles are low human influence sites, so low levels of urbanization, and triangles are moderate levels of urbanization. If there's no difference, those points are going to be on top of each other, right? Seems pretty reasonable. Now, if our prediction that they might be consuming more non-protein energy, right, focusing more on carbohydrates and fats when they're available to regulate that protein, then we might see something more like this, right, where the moderate human influence sites where we think this is more so happening because that's where they're eating, for example, the cats and other sorts of things, then we might see this kind of moving up, right, to less protein, right, and then an increase in those other things. Now, one thing that is important also is we can only interpret this data relative to the intake target, right? That value that I mentioned before that we assess in a laboratory setting, right? To see exactly what is going on here, to know what they're actually trying to regulate for, right? Or how much. Now, unfortunately, no one's done this in coyotes, right? Haven't done this in coyotes, but we have done it in a close relative. The dog. This is a painting of my dog. Yeah, he helped. And so we do know for dogs that it's about 30% protein, 7% carbs, 63% fat. So they try to just keep low protein, try to increase their fat intake in particular when everything is available all at once, right? And so we can then draw a line that keeps protein consistent, right? The consumption of protein consistent. So if we're moving closer to this line, then that means we're trying to better if we're on this side of this line, that means maybe we're over-consuming protein. And if we're above this line, then maybe we're under-consuming protein, right? So what did we actually find? So here there's the dog, right? Their intake target with that line. And then I'm going to plot all the things that they ate, right? So the things that they ate were almost all vertebrates. So no carbs, all protein and fat. And then they also ate some vegetative matter, like that mesquite that I mentioned before, which is all carbs and low in protein and low in fat. So what did we actually find? So the triangles here are the spring, and the circles are the fall. So what we observe essentially, and the different colors correspond with urbanization, which it seems like maybe there's something happening here, but again, we don't have stats to know exactly how big that difference is. But instead, I want to hone in on something that I find really interesting, is that it seems like in the fall and winter, they're potentially trying to move more towards this line, right? More towards the intake target of protein, right? So maybe they're over-consuming this protein here. Again, though, this is an exploratory kind of first look at what coyotes are eating in terms of nutrition. No one's ever done this before, right? But they're clearly, their nutritional, the macronutrient composition of their diets change seasonally, right? And what was happening seasonally? Well, there was a lot of this. A lot of mesquite seeds. And in fact, 25% of the volume of their scats was mesquite in the fall and winter season when it was seasonally available. Now, what does this mean for cats? So the interesting thing about cats, 18% of the volume of their scats was domestic cats across seasons, only in the more urbanized sites, right? And again, these are a high-fat food. And so what I think might be happening, and again, this is despite low spatial availability, right? So what I think might be happening is perhaps this corresponds with non-protein energy consumption, right? Trying to regulate that protein consumption. And so perhaps, if we understand this, linking it back to the SEEP framework, we've now looked at this phenotype, how do we link it back to those inputs? Perhaps these regional differences we observe are actually about this availability of non-protein energy, right? Out here, there's a lot more deer for them to eat, for example, and they do eat a lot more deer. Out here, very high-fat food, or even the availability of high-carb human food subsidies right out here. Maybe that's what's going on. Okay, so overall, use diet as a phenotype to understand the relationship between the urban environment and human-wildlife conflict. And so because of that, we now have more avenues to understand why coyote behavior may differ depending on social, ecological, and evolutionary inputs, which can support more targeted management interventions. Now, I know I'm coming close on time. I only have a couple more slides. I just want to go through a couple more slides to show this is all great, but what am I doing now, right? And how am I applying this now? So the first is with beavers. Quite different from the mighty coyote, but the beaver, just like us, right? I said earlier, they're an ecosystem engineer and do really interesting things with the environment. And specifically, this project in collaboration with Dr. Zion Kloss at Marist, who's a hydrologist, as well as Marist students. Lots of students are helping out with this, which is a theme running throughout all of my work, like all the dissertation work that I showed before, also had heavy involvement by students. And so this came to be through an observation that Zion had. As a hydrologist, right, he was working in beaver ponds, and normally, and if I mess this up, I'm so sorry, I'm not a hydrologist, but it's my understanding, right, that when it rains, that results in greater nutrient loads moving downstream, like more nitrogen, more phosphates, things moving like that moving downstream. And in drier periods, the opposite happens. But Zion noticed that in beaver ponds, phosphate movement was greater in drier periods. What's up with that? Well, in speaking to some colleagues, it sounds like maybe it's these guys, right? Apparently in dry periods, the hypothesis is that they're burrowing more and releasing more phosphates, right? And so currently working with students using camera traps and other approaches and water quality analyses to kind of link the phenotype here to the SEEP processes, including here at Cary, is our hope, yes. Okay, and what else? So why do some areas have challenges with lots of deer, coyotes, raccoons, and other species while others don't? So this is something else that I observed at Marist. So Marist has this great little nature preserve called Fern Tor Nature Preserve at the north side of campus. And it has, and I've put a bunch of camera traps out there with students, and it has so many cool, fun species, right? We got fisher, we got deer, we got coyotes, we got foxes, bobcats, and so much more, right? So many things. But then on campus, we don't see them. What's up with that, right? And so I have a hypothesis that maybe the preserve is acting as a refuge for wildlife, right? So that's linking it back to those socio-eco-evolutionary processes. On the other hand, or I should say, and then if it is, that's promoting human-wildlife coexistence, right, by keeping them there, and then we don't have to deal with them in an adverse way. Alternatively, maybe they are coming onto campus, but at night, right? So that's that kind of phenotype linkage. And then maybe, on the other hand, wildlife are equally on campus, but we don't have cameras there to see them, and also it's a wider space compared to the preserve, which is small, right? All these things might be true, and so this is something I plan to implement using camera traps next year, and also seeking collaborators, because a lot of universities have these cool little living laboratory nature preserves, right next to campus. So lots of opportunities to look at that. So in summary, how do we promote more sustainable futures for people and wildlife, like this? We do that by understanding that the variation we're seeking is a feature, not a bug of the system, right? And so by using phenotype as a measurable way to assess drivers of variation, we can start to approach generality in urban ecology, particularly in ways that allow us to solve real-world problems, which is what we're all here for anyway. And so in terms of the future, let's work together. Let's be this. Look at them, they're friends. Okay. These are so many people, right, helped with a lot of the work that was shown here today. And with that, thank you. Any questions? Yes. Yes, no, I got you.
Okay, so I was curious about the first part of your talk when you were talking about looking at different traits and see if you can explain some generality
Yeah.
on that. And I was wondering if you ever look at trait combinations or trait interactions and like phenotypic landscapes and
Yeah.
evolutionary phenotypic landscapes.
Yes, thank you, thank you. So the question was asking, earlier in the talk, talked about all these different traits that we've looked at. Have we looked at how traits interact with each other, and if that affects phenotypic landscapes? I have not. I would really like to, though, and I think that would be really cool and interesting, because I do wonder as well if it maybe is part of this context, right? It's some combination of this to make this kind of secret sauce, right, of what kind of works in an urbanized setting. I have thought a lot about how, thinking of just like evolutionary landscapes and things like that, how management activities like truncate population distributions and trait distributions such that it then makes it harder or easier to, if you think of like conflict as almost being on one of those landscapes, right? It might actually make it harder or easier to move up or down like a conflict landscape if you think of it like analogous to that. But in terms of the interactions of the different traits, I haven't looked into that. And to my knowledge, I don't know actually if other folks have been doing that work as well. I think a lot of that might have to be in part because it's challenging, but also a lot of the work in mammals that I think is a huge limitation in terms of the trait space is that it's almost all looking at species level averages of traits, right? Because to be able to get actual population data, you got to trap a bunch of animals, you got to measure all these things. Some of these animals, like coyotes, are notoriously hard to trap, for example. And so it can become really hard and complicated, right? It's not like plants that don't move. And so I also think that is something that this space really needs to think pretty critically about, is finding new ways and innovative ways to try to capture the actual trait data and not just assume that whatever we think is average for the species is true. Not to belabor this, but just as an illustration of that I showed a graph about like nocturnal, diurnal, cathemeral species and like how everything was different. That paper was actually one that I was a part of where we used camera trap data to see, are we even right about what we think the average trait values are for activity patterns? And we found we are not. So it's also possible that a lot of these species level averages are just wrong. So that's fun. Sounds like a great grad student project. No. Yeah?
When you look at the diet data, and you've got like your volume, this component or that component.
Yeah.
Is that, okay, I've got this material here that I've recovered from the scat, it's the volume of cat fur versus the volume of,
Yeah, so.
or are you trying to reconstruct, like,
Yeah.
what's the mass of this cat?
Yeah, so, and this is going to sound, I'm going to say something that's going to sound really really unsatisfying, but is nonetheless true and has been evidenced to, aside from to be the second best approach, right? The first best approach when assessing diet is you do this, which I'll explain clearer in a moment, and then you also have what's called a fecal correction factor. And a fecal correction factor is basically where you have had an animal in a laboratory captive setting, and you feed them other animals, and you see how long it takes them to poop stuff out, how much is left over, and what did they actually eat, right? Because also different parts of an animal contribute different amounts of macronutrients and things like that, right? And so unfortunately, most species don't have that information, right? Or only have it for, like, coyotes. They have that information for small rodents, and that's it. And obviously, they eat a lot more than just small rodents, right? And so we weren't able to use that. But in absence of that, it is actually, the percent volume is considered the next best approach. But it is done in an unsatisfying way, which is you look at it and you go, that's 100%. Essentially, right? Like there's processes where you go and you look at the hair and you take different samples to make sure the whole thing is probably the same species. But then you essentially just put it into groups and visually say, this looks approximately to be about 50% of the scat, this amount percent of the scat, et cetera. And you do this per scat. And then to kind of help deal with that unsatisfying thing, you then essentially sum it up across all of the scats and average it. So then you hope that some of that variation kind of gets washed out in kind of the process. But this is a challenge when you are working with animals, right? Is I can't go up to them and say, what did you eat today? Right? You have to either go through this process, use stable isotopes, which have a whole other suite of challenges associated with them, or look at stomach contents. And those are basically the ways that we can know, right, what these animals are eating, short of following them around. But yeah, did that answer your question? Yeah, great.
One more question.
Yeah.
So is there any indication, or do you have data to be able to answer whether or not differences in percent cat in the diet could be related to the environment, like cats can escape better in some areas?
Yeah. Yeah, no, so don't have information, or sorry, is there any indication about the environment specifically affecting the distribution of cats and that impacting coyotes eating the cats? Is that correct?
The ability of a cat to evade a coyote.
The ability of a cat to evade a coyote. Okay, so for this project, no, that wasn't something we were able to assess because we weren't able to know the quality of the characteristics of the cat that was eaten, right? We just get the back end component. But there are people currently thinking through that. No one has done it yet, but there are a lot of people talking about actually how maybe feral cats are harder to catch because a feral cat, they're ready, right? They're out there, they've seen some stuff, they're ready to fight. But Fluffy, the indoor-outdoor cat of your house, is just moseying along, having a lovely day, and sees, oh, look, a dog, oh no, right? And so maybe that is something. And so people are actually currently thinking about doing behavioral assays where they set up robot cats that have different behaviors and seeing if that affects if coyotes eat them or not. I've heard many people talk about this, but no one has actually, to my knowledge, done it yet. So if anyone here is interested in that, I could get you in touch with some cool people. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.